Welcome to Developing cPanel Applications. Today we'll talk about how to create add-ons for cPanel and WHM. Before we get into that, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm Matt Deese. I'm an integration developer here at cPanel, which means I do third-party development support, meaning I help people create their add-ons for cPanel and WHM. Then I also work on integration-related features, meaning that if we need to improve the way that a piece of our code works, I can help you with that. And then I also write documentation for cPanel and WHM integration-related features. So most of the docs you see on the site are written by me. So why create add-ons? Hosting is a very competitive market. And if you have a vanilla cPanel install, from one host to another, there's very little differentiation that you can show your clients. If you develop a custom add-on, that allows you to add a value to your hosting product that other people don't have. And generally, it's cheaper than other solutions. And also, throughout this presentation, we're talking about a lot of concepts about how cPanel works. And understanding those concepts will help you better troubleshoot cPanel and WHM issues that you have on your own servers. So when we talk about an add-on, what all is included with that? Well, first there's the plugin registration file, which is used for making the icon appear inside of cPanel and WHM. And it defines things like the name, what group it goes in, and all sorts of other information. We have our UI components, which is the front end for your plugin, which is written in PHP, HTML, or CGI. Then we have backend Perl modules, which are used for adding API calls into cPanel. And then there's the installation script, which is just a script for installing your add-on. First, we're going to talk about the plugin registration file, which you can generate at cpanel.net/developer/overview.html. What this is used for is for adding UI elements to the cPanel index page. Meaning that if you want to add an icon to that initial page that your users see when they log in, this is how you do that. This may be the only thing that your plugin needs, because if you're linking to an external resource, all you have to do is create this file and link to it, and that's all you should have to do. So here's the bottom half of the plugin registration page. The top half is all talking about things like what name do you want it in, what group do you want it in, do you want it to be in a new group, do you want it as a feature? All those things are kind of self-explanatory, so we're really not going to cover that. So the first option that we have on this bottom half is the display order, which defines weight is this icon displayed with, meaning that if it has a weight of 0, it's going to be displayed first, or if it has a weight of 1,000, it's going to be displayed last. You can also use negative numbers to kind of preempt whatever we might put in there. Then we have the access URL, which is literally what you want to link to. On the site, we say that it needs to be a relative path to user local cPanel base front end. This is not true. Rather, you can link to an absolute path to an external URL. And then we have the anchor content. This is any additional information inside the A tag of the link. Meaning that if you wanted to have target equals blank to have it open up in a new window, you can do that by adding that into this anchor content. Then we have the on-click event, which is any JavaScript that you might want to have happen when this link is clicked. Meaning that if you don't want it to open another page, you populate this field to do that. And then our plugin icon, which is just in a 32 by 32 image file that you upload. Now, we state here that we will resize anything that's not 32 by 32, but we highly suggest doing it. It also says it takes JPEG or PNG, but the output format it uses is PNG. So you should put PNG into it. Now, after you hit submit on this form, it's going to offer you a .cPanel plugin file for download. What this is a file that contains all the information you just put into the form, plus a base64 encoded version of the image. You can place into your server a /root, then run user local cPanel bin register _ cPanel plugins, space the path to the plugin file, and after that happens, the plugin file will display in the X3 theme and any theme that uses the branding getAppList API2 call. And that's all there really is to talk about with the registration files. I think it's a really simple, straightforward concept. So now we're going to talk about the cPanel front end. And what I mean by that is how do we add HTML into cPanel? Well, first we have the document root, which is located at user local cPanel base. Within here, it is contained all the third-party applications run, all the themes used on your server, and any other various information that's needed to be accessible by the browser. Each directory has specific rules. A theme directory are the only directories that can call API calls. While you have the user local based third-party directory, which is used for loading any third-party applications, such as PHP MyAdmin or round cube email. Now, for now, we're just going to talk about the X3 directory. In here is the HTML used for generating all of the UI of cPanel and WHM. Now, when you're working with cPanel and WHM, HTML is treated as an interpreted language, meaning that we add in our own custom HTML calls that are actually API calls on our side that display output. So here on this slide, you'll see that we have cPanel branding equals include standard header. What that does is that creates the standard header for the cPanel page. Then we also have div class body content. That's just how we define, hey, this is where all the data we want to display on this page goes. And then we have another one of those include calls for showing the footer. If we were to actually put this into an HTML page and load it up in the browser, this is what we would see. As you can see, the area where we want to put content comes up nice, aligned in the middle, and this is pretty much your slate for making a plugin with. Now, this is the last time I'll show you a screenshot within this presentation. So anything in the future you see from this point on, any output you see, just imagine it on this page. Now, what actually happens when we load up that page? Well, first, cpservd, which is the HTTP server that cPanel uses, receives a request for foo.html. At this point, it goes, okay, I'm receiving this request on port 2083, which is the privileged port that cPanel works on, and it launches a cPanel process with the HTML file as the parameter. At this point, it will parse through that HTML file looking for any cPanel tag or CP tag or API calls. Then when it finds one of those, parses out the API calls, executes the Perl function, applies any templating that's been applied, and displays the file. And displays the raw HTML that you want the user to see. Now, that sounds kind of complex, but really we're going to talk about building every single piece to do that throughout the rest of this presentation. Now, another thing you need to understand about cPanel is that nearly everything you see inside the cPanel UI is an API call, meaning that when you log into the cPanel interface and you see all those icons on there, that's an API call. When you see the stats bar, that's an API call. When you list out your databases, add an email account, or install a Perl module inside of cPanel, that's all done through API calls, which actually has some interesting implications if you want to create a remote interface for cPanel. We actually have some customers at this point going and creating a remote version of cPanel that their users can log into, then it logs into the server itself. So the users never actually see the cPanel UI themselves, and they can do whatever they want with it. So first, what type of APIs do we have available? cPanel has API 1 and API 2. API 1 kind of being the API that we used in cPanel 10 and earlier. We still use it in the current product, but it's kind of regarded as a legacy thing. It takes order-based arguments, meaning that when you call a function with an API 1, you're going to be calling it in an order base. There is no name, there's no real definition of parameters other than the order it comes in at. And then it only prints a string as output, which can cause some serious issues when you're working with the XML-API. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then we have API 2, which take name-based arguments, meaning that an argument in API 2 is like a URL parameter, meaning that if you're going to add an email account, you might pass in a parameter for called password equals the password, which means they can be passed in any order, and it translates really well into a HTTP interface. And when API 2 returns data, it returns data structures, meaning that it will return a hash or an array of hashes of information, which is very useful for working with and translates well into an XML or JSON type response. So here's an example of an API 1 call. This is net DNS lookup, which what this API call does is it will return the A records and MX records for any domain you provide to it. When you call it, you call cPanel, you do the HTML, the cPanel HTML tag, and then as an attribute of it, you do net equals, colon, DNS lookup, which defines the function. DNS lookup is considered the function, while net is considered the API module. Then inside the parentheses, we have the parameters. And with net DNS lookup, we only have one parameter, which is the zone you want to look up. In this case, we use the form DNS to pull that in. Now, something that's important to note about this form variable is this allows you to pull any information that's get or posted to a page in cPanel and bring it into your page as a variable. Meaning that if you want to sit there and create a form that works with cPanel, you're going to have to use this on the page that receives that form to pull in that data. At the bottom, here's the output from API 1. As you can see, it's a very straightforward string. Now let's take another look at an API 1 call. This is MySQL add-DB, but this time, rather than just showing you a basic example of how the syntax looks, we're going to look at this actually how it would be used inside a page. First, if you'll notice, is that we have the actual API call commented out via HTML. That's to suppress the output from the browser with this API call, meaning that we can change the data used from this API call. Now then below it, you'll see all these cPanel if tags. What cPanel if does is that it takes a variable that's available to the interface and allows you to evaluate it, meaning that you can do a greater than, less than, or you can just check it for Boolean type responses. In this case, we're checking for CP error, which anytime an API 1 function is called, it will set the CP error tag if there's an error. So here we're doing cPanel if, not CP error. Then we're going to display that, hey, this addition was successful. Then we're going to do a second one of those cPanel if tags with basically saying cPanel if CP error MySQL, then say, hey, there was a failure, letting you know that something went wrong. And that's really the extreme basics of how API 1 works. Now we're going to talk about API 2. As I mentioned earlier, API 2 takes name-based arguments, which we'll look at in a second here, and returns back data structures. Now, inside this screen, you can see that I'm displaying this data structure as XML. This is actually pulled from our XML-API, which is kind of an abstraction of both of these two APIs. And here you can see that list users in DB returns back two sets of data, which is actually on the Perl side an array of hashes, which both contain DB and user, which basically states which users have access to the cptest_forum database. Now, when you're working with a data structure, it's not very useful to just have it returned as a data structure to the user. That's not something that they care to see. Generally, you're going to have to template it. And to do that, we have a CP tag. This is similar to the cPanel tag seen earlier, but in my opinion, it's a lot more complex to work with, but the long-term gain of a tag of this nature is definitely worth it. So we have CP MySQL-FE : list users in DB. That defines our module function that we're calling. Then we have our template. As you can see, this isn't really a defined template language. Rather, it's something that we've just put in over the years. And these percent signs you see refer to the DB and user you see after the template. Then any HTML tag that you want to display needs to have its greater than and less than signs replaced with square brackets. So in this case, you see that we have B%, which means the DB output parameter, close B, %, meaning we would just want to do a line break. And then those percents, the first one goes to DB, the second goes to user. Which I realize that's kind of complex, and if you look at sdk.cpanel.net/API2, you can see everything about how to write this syntax. Then afterwards, we have DB equals form DB, meaning that we want to pull in whatever get or post data was sent to the page called DB. And at the bottom, here's the output from that API2 tag. Now, what if you're wanting to use AJAX? I mean, if you've looked at cPanel WHM over the past year, we've added quite a few interfaces that use AJAX for making things a lot more responsive. Well, to do that, we use the XML-API, which is actually an API we developed for Web Host Manager. However, we have gone ahead and added a cPanel wrapper call that can be accessed as any user for performing AJAX calls from cPanel. Now, when working with this, we only recommend that you use API 2. As you saw earlier, API 1 only prints strings. So if you're trying to use that with the XML API, sometimes API 1 will print HTML as output, sometimes will print other things as output that you don't want in there. And will break syntax parsing for either JSON or HTML. The cPanel call, which is used for calling API 1 and API 2, takes a few parameters. When you call it, you're going to call /XML-API/cPanel, then pass in the parameters you see on the slide. The first parameter you see will be cPanel_XML-API_module, which defines the module of the call you're wanting to call. So in the example we showed earlier, you'd pass in MySQL-FE here. cPanel_XML-API_func defines the function you want to call. So we'd pass in list users with DB here. Now, we also have the cPanel_XML-API_API version, which is actually optional. This is only needed if you want to specify API 1, which in case you'd pass 1 here. With API 2, that's the default parameter, so you don't usually need to pass that. We also have cPanel underscore XML-API underscore user, which is used if you're authenticated as root using this call and you want to perform an action on a cPanel account. So this is the XML-API cPanel call. On the left, we have the input, which is XML-API/cPanel, which is used for defining what XML-API call we want to call. When you're working from the cPanel interface, the only call you'll ever want to call. Then we have cPanel underscore XML-API underscore module, which defines the module we're calling, in this case email. Then we have cPanel underscore XML-API underscore func, which defines the function we're calling, in this case passwd_pop, to change the password of an account. Then the parameters for passwd_pop are domain, email, and password. So in this case, we're going to pass in domain, email, and password as URL parameters to the API call. When this is executed, you will see the XML response on the left. Now, let's say you don't want to get an XML response. Let's say you want to get a JSON response. All you have to do is take every mention of XML on the input parameters example here and replace it with JSON. And that's how you get that result. And it will be the same data. They both take exactly the same code paths. Now, in this response, we have two areas you really need to be concerned with. First, we have the data node, which contains reason and result. These are used when an API2 call performs an action that's not listing, meaning that it performs an event like changing a password or adding a database or something along those lines. And what reason means is this is a string explanation of what happened, meaning it might define the failure or the reason for failure, such as there weren't enough pop accounts allocated to the mail account, or the result, which is the Boolean response, 1 or 0, did it pass or fail? Then we also have the event, which defines whether the call was run. So if a call fails in running or something before you run that call fails, the event result node will be 0. Otherwise, it'll be 1, even if the call fails to do whatever action you asked it to do. So what if you want to use PHP to develop your cPanel front end? Well, you have two implementations to do that, which you have the cpphp/phpcp, which basically tells cPanel that, okay, I want you to go through this file and parcel the PHP tags, then execute the cPanel tags, or the cPanel tags, then parcel the PHP tags. That is one option. Or you have the LivePHP system, which the LivePHP system is an object-based access into the cPanel APIs. And when you run PHP on cPanel, it executes PHP as a CGI under the user that's executing it. So in terms of permissions, there really isn't that great a risk in doing this. So let's take a quick look at cpPHP. I know I kind of gave a rushed explanation of it earlier, so let's take a look at this in a little more detail. We have a cpPHP file, which we have PHP $mailserver equals then an API call, encapsulated in quotes. When this is run, it's going to be run in two stages. cPanel D is going to execute over this and execute the cPanel tags, then output a file to be executed by PHP. So after it gets its first pass, it's going to look like the temporary file at the bottom, and then that's going to be what's sent into the PHP interpreter. Really, I think this is kind of a very basic system, and for more information, you can go to sdk.cpanel.net/php. This is the LivePHP system, which is a class for accessing our APIs from PHP. This is much more robust than cpPHP, because if you have a scenario where you're wanting to pull our APIs for something, then do a MySQL lookup, and then perform another API call based off of it, this is kind of your only option for doing this, unless you want a two-page process. This works under the same code as the XML API. The only difference is that this cPanel will listen on an internal socket rather than going over HTTP for everything. So things are a lot faster, and you don't have to concern yourself quite as much with authentication. This is an example of a LivePHP script. At the top, we have include user local cPanel PHP cPanel.php, which includes the LivePHP class. Now, this can only be run from files with a .live.php file name. When cPanel D gets a request to process a live.php file, it will open up the socket that I've mentioned earlier for communication. So in the next line, we have cPanel equals new cPanel. This instantiates the class and opens up the socket connection. Under that, we have mail accounts equals cPanel API2 email list pops with disk. What this is doing is assigning the variable mail accounts with an associative array of the output of email list pops with disks. And this allows us to iterate over all this information inside a for each loop at the bottom and display just the email accounts on the server. This is very useful for templating and quite a few other scenarios. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the backend of cPanel. Really, I can't go into too much detail on this subject because it's a very complex subject and it would really take 3 or 4 hours to cover all the ground that we needed to cover this properly. And so if you want to learn more about this, sdk.cpanel.net is your place. My only goal here is to introduce you to the concepts. So when you're working with the cPanel backend, there's a few things you need to understand. First is that it's not using the system Perl. It's using compiled Perl 5.6.2, which has a few implications with it. Since it's not using the system Perl, you can't use cPan with this. And on top of that, any modules you use that use XS will break. So you have to ensure that you're using pure Perl implementations of whatever module you're trying to use in this case. Any API call you add needs to be done in the cPanel : namespace. And user code needs to be placed into user local cPanel. What I mean by user code is code that you develop. Then vendor modules, any module that you want to put in there. Say you want to put data dumper in there. That'd go into user local cPanel Perl. The reason this is done is just kind of differentiate between what is provided by someone who's not you and what's provided by you. Here's a very basic example of an API 1 call. Now, if you're familiar with Perl programming, you'll know that this is a package. And we define it within the cPanel namespace, and then we have demo API 1, which is just the name of the API module that we're using. Then we have sub-demo API 1 _ init. This subroutine is required for every single API 1 module that you write. This is used for any setup code that you want to do. So if you have an HTML page that executes several API 1 calls, you can use this to run code before the rest of those are run, and it's only run once. Then we have sub-demo API 1 _ UC. What this subroutine is a subroutine that will print out a string in uppercase. Very simple example. And as you can see, it just does print UC string that you pull in via the standard Perl method of pulling in parameters. And if you wanted to call this through the cPanel interface, you'd have the cPanel tag space demo API equals UC, then appear in uppercase, and then close out the tag. And when that's displayed inside the cPanel interface, it'll all appear in uppercase. If you want to add an API 2 call, the process is a little more complex. Since API 2 takes in name parameters and works with data structures, you have to be concerned with how you're pulling things in. In this case, we have API 2 _ ls, which is just a very simple, exploitable subroutine that should never be used in the wild for listing out files in a directory. We pull in the arguments, then assign it to a hash. Automatically do the conversion of the arguments over to the hash format. Then we have myFileList equals split ls, then ops, which means that we're going to basically perform an ls on the directory in question, and then return all those from in a file's hash. And then we also have the sub-API2 function, which is used as kind of a dispatch to define how an API call maps to a function. That covers all I can talk about API calls for now. So if you want more information, please go to sdk.cpanel.net/writing API calls. So let's say you need to run code as root. This happens in quite a few scenarios within cPanel WHM. For example, let's say you want to add a new root running service, a new mail service, something like that you have to authenticate against. Well, you don't always want your users being able to write those configuration files. So to do that, we have the AdminBin/cpwrap system that allows you to run code as root in a secure and controlled manner. Now, naturally, this is a major security concern. So when you're doing this, there are a few tips you should be aware of. First is that only code that needs to run as root should run as root. Second, validate any and all input that comes into this system. And third is that make sure that you really do need to run as root. I cannot stress that enough. When you're working with the AdminBin and cpwrap system, there are a few parts you need to be concerned with. You have the cPanel AdminBin module, which provides you the method interfaces for executing the admin binary. The admin binary is responsible for two things. It's responsible for escalating privileges and ensuring that it's called from an allowable source. And two, it's responsible for executing the script, which is written in Perl or PHP or whatever language you want, to perform the action you want to have executed. Then there's the admin script, which is actually what contains the logic you want to run as root. This is where all the heavy lifting is done. And really, it's just a simple script with a predefined interface that takes input via standard in. So let's talk a little bit more about that process in detail. You have your API call module, which will then call cPanel : adminbin / admin fetch no cache. That is a module that allows you to run an escalated piece of code as root and return back a data structure. What that will do is then it will call the wrapper binary, which is that setUID binary we talked about earlier. The wrapper binary will ensure that 1, you're trying to execute allowable code, 2, it's being called from a cPanel user, 3, that is being executed by the cPanel binary itself, meaning that someone on the shell can execute this binary. Then, once it's verified that all these things are correct, it executes the admin script. Then, when it executes the admin script, it leaves it running as a subprocess, writes the parameters that you passed into cPanel AdminBin into standard in of the admin script, and the admin script then goes, okay, I'm being called from this UID with this action and these parameters. Those parameters are then taken, it performs whatever action you may be. In some cases, it may be working with SQL. In some cases, it may be working with a multitude of other things. And then returns back a data structure in the storable format to the admin binary, and the admin binary sends it back through the cPanel AdminBin module. That is really all there is to this system. Now, obviously, as you can tell, I didn't provide any code for this. The reason for that is that when I do a write-up on this, it takes about 3,000 words to explain, and fitting that onto slides just isn't feasible. So rather, I suggest you do sdk.cpanel.net/cpwrap. Now, when you package your script, as of this point, there is no standard packaging format for cPanel and WHM add-ons. So really, you just execute a shell script, and that puts all the pieces in place for your add-on and installs it. That's all that needs to happen at this point. Keep your eyes open in the future. We may have something coming in that sense. So that really kind of rounds out everything we have to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit more extra resources that you have when developing your add-on. First, we have sdk.cpanel.net, which contains all the documentation for cPanel and WHM. Then we have our developer forums, which we have at forums.cpanel.net, where if you're having a problem figuring out how something works, or you need help with a piece of code you don't mind the public seeing, you can post there and me or one of the other staff members will help you out. Then we also have a ticket system, where if you're having something that requires privileges to understand or want to give us access to source or something like that, you can go to tickets.cpanel.net/submit and submit a ticket to us, and we'll try to help you where you can. Now, our terms of support will usually mean that in a lot of cases we won't be able to help you. But if it is an issue with our APIs, we will help you. Then we also have the integration blog, which is a blog I write and try to post about once a month about how to write add-ons and how to do other things that are integration related with cPanel and WHM. Thank you for watching.